Welcome to the Prospective Doctor Podcast, where we will provide essential information for pre-medical students and those already in medical school. Listen each week for tips on how to improve your application and gain an acceptance to medical school.
Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to this week's Prospective Doctor and Med School Coach podcast. We're excited to have you guys join us today. And today we have such an awesome guest with us that I think every one of you guys is going to really benefit from listening to the conversation that myself and Nick are going to have here in a little bit. So I want to introduce you to our guest, Nick Zehner, who is a Stanford medical student and the founder of My Testing Solutions, which is a CARS, MCAT critical analysis and reasoning section, question bank and material section, which I think is extremely popular out there. And I think it's going to really give everybody out there who's listening some awesome advice about the MCAT CARS section and how to approach it, as well as what Testing Solutions can kind of do for you. So without further ado, I want to thank Nick for coming on board. Nick, welcome aboard.
Hi, Sahil. Thanks so much. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk with you a little bit.
So, Nick, I wanted to just start with understanding a little bit about you. Tell me a little bit about where you are, who you are, how you got to where you are currently, which is a Stanford medical student.
Yeah, well, I am a Hoosier. And so for those who don't know, that means I was born in Indiana. I grew up in a really small kind of cornfield town and went to college in the small town that I grew up in. So kind of some humble beginnings. After college, went into the Peace Corps, kind of wandered around and did that for a few years, and then ended up doing a master's degree in philosophy of religion at Harvard, and then entered into the med school stream. So kind of a wandering path in some way. So hopefully that gives some of your non-traditional listeners some hope.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think kind of speaks to the larger theme that I think we're seeing in medical school admissions these days, where there's, a real value to a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds that maybe 10, 15 years ago wasn't as on the minds of admissions. So anyways, that's kind of how I ended up where I did. And
wow.
It's been a good journey. So
yeah, I mean, that's such an amazing path to go from Indiana in the Hoosier State and then to the Peace Corps. And where did you do the Peace Corps? Where were you stationed?
I was in the Dominican Republic in a little coffee village up in a mountain about 2 hours from the Haitian border.
Amazing.
So, yeah, I got to drink quite a bit of good coffee there. So I arrived drinking Folgers and left a little bit more coffee snob. But yeah,
wow,
it was a great couple of years.
That's amazing. And then on to Harvard and now at Stanford. So, and I understand that you're actually currently still tapping into some of those international medicine routes, right? You're currently in Uganda?
That is correct. The amazing technology we have today. I am in Uganda, right on the Kenyan border, in a town called Tororo, doing a year off with research on malaria. So, yep, staying out on the wandering path a little bit. It's a good time here.
And with all these amazing things that you're doing, you're also obviously doing medical school, have finished up your third year at Stanford, and I think you eventually want to go into internal medicine, if I'm correct.
That is the game plan right now. We will see what clerkships does to me, but that's the game plan. Do medicine and maybe even an IED fellowship. We'll have to see where the winds take me.
Awesome. So you're really already, without anything else, such an amazing sort of story, such an amazing, I would say, mentor, and something that I think all pre-med students would certainly aspire to, being able to do all these amazing things internationally with extra degrees at medical school. And then on top of all this, you've started Testing Solutions. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, the impetus kind of came when I was preparing for the MCAT back in the day a number of years ago, and really felt like there was just a paucity of strong, at that time it was a verbal reasoning section, but essentially CARS materials out there, both in terms of practice materials, but also kind of a guide to them. I majored in philosophy in undergrad, and then, as I said, went on to do a master's degree. So in some regards, it was kind of always a forte, but I had a number of friends in college that were pre-meds and really found that section to be the hardest. It really was in many ways kind of a separate skill set that didn't get developed or honed in the kind of traditional classes. And so kind of having those two pieces come together, both my own personal, just I really like those kinds of skills and thinking and kind of seek that out in my own life. But then also having some friends that struggled with that, it just, the stars kind of aligned. And really it's been a slow boil. You know, I know as you've started med school, Coach, and over a number of years built that. That's really been my experience with testing solutions. I didn't really expect it to get to kind of the offering and the reach that it has now. It's been an interesting journey, to say the least. But yeah, that's how it got started.
Awesome. You know, I mean, I remember when I took the MCAT, and I got to say that verbal, which is what it was called back then, was definitely the section that 100% I struggled the most with. Without a doubt, verbal reasoning was the thing that gave me fits. And I think that's true for a lot of students, particularly those who maybe are science heavy in their background. Tell me a little bit about why you think that people struggle with the verbal or what's now the CARS section.
I think there are kind of two reasons that it's a really difficult section. And I think the first, and this is really one of the biggest things that I've noticed with one-on-one tutoring, but also kind of developing my resources through the years and interacting with now hundreds of students, probably close to 1,000 now. But most people, if you set them down with a CARS passage and let them have as much time as they wanted to answer it, they would do very well. The issue is really doing it in 90 minutes, right? So you have 9 passages on a wide range of topics. You've probably never thought or heard about what you're going to read, and you've got to get through 53 questions in 90 minutes. And despite, you know, kind of in an untimed environment, being able to probably do pretty well, probably get close to a score you'd be happy with, when you throw in that ingredient of time, you know, where students have to manage how long they're going to spend reading the passage, how much they're going to spend on each question. When you throw in that element, it really gets difficult to perform at the level that you probably already actually naturally can. So I would say that is the number one reason that most students struggle. And then I think the second is if you haven't spent much time reading content that is outside the sciences, you know, the CARS section only deals with social science topics and humanities. There are no natural sciences. You know, if you haven't spent much time reading or thinking critically in those domains, it can feel really foreign and really unfamiliar.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's why you see people who tend to do well in the CARS are people who have a humanities background or a social science background. So I think those two elements kind of paired together really lead to CARS being a tough section for a lot of people. Like, you know, your experience, I think, is very much par for the course. I hear time and time again, CARS is the hardest section. And I don't know how many of your listeners are in Canada, but it's actually the section Canadian medical schools look at. My knowledge of it is that they don't actually look at the science sections. So for a lot of the Canadian students, it's even more important. But for pretty much everybody, it's a really important section to get started on early.
Yeah, you know, actually there was a study a number of years ago that kind of correlated the performance on verbal reasoning and I think it was the eventual performance on the board exams. And that was the section that 100% correlated the best comparatively to what was then called the biological sciences and the physical sciences section. It was a lot about just the comprehension and the ability to sort of understand and quickly, as you mentioned, read and comprehend what's going on in a passage. Because while you're doing that for a passage in CARS, in reality, in medical school or in medicine in general, you're doing that for every single patient you come across, right? There's this huge history and physical, there's charts of information, there's lab tests, there's radiology tests, and it's all sort of how do you pick out the right things, condense them, and figure out what the differential diagnosis or the eventual treatment is. And that's what correlated well. So definitely medical schools, as you mentioned, in Canada, put such an emphasis on it, but also in the U.S., put a huge emphasis on the now CARS section. And I think a lot of people find that frustrating, right? Because they're science students, they're biology majors, chemistry majors. They expect that medicine is biology and chemistry and biochemistry, and they want medical schools to kind of think the same way. But the reality is med schools know how important it is to be able to, let's say, critically analyze a passage and get to the correct information on it. I get a lot of students who come to me and definitely struggle, like I used to, on the CARS section. And they often ask, what advice do you have? What materials out there? What can I do to raise my score? I mean, do you have like maybe a top 3 advice, points that you give to students as when they come to you with that question?
There are a number of things that you can put into play pretty quickly to set yourself on the right track. But I think the number one ingredient is giving yourself enough time in advance of your test. And so that would be the first thing I would just say is make sure that you are starting your CARS preparations. I prefer to say, most students have a 3-month dedicated study period. That's kind of the general rule of thumb. And I really advocate for adding a 4th month at the beginning on the front end and using that month, a couple hours a day, not something crazy intense, but using that to start thinking about CARS when you're not distracted with the other sections. So that would be kind of the first thing, is to get a good CARS resource, learn about the test, learn about the question types, start reading some passages and see how you're doing, what skill set you might need, to tweak, or what your strengths already are. And if you can do that, in that first month, then you have the next 3 months to do practice passages and review. Because the reality is, while there are things you can do to make pretty quick jumps in your score, most people find that their improvements are gradual over time. And so it's very difficult to have a huge jump in CARS score, especially if you're already in the 125, 126 range, to get up into the 128, 129. Most people, that takes a little bit of time. It's not simply just kind of a flip the switch and all of a sudden you're there. So that would be the first thing, is just to make sure that you give yourself enough time to practice. And then I think another very important skill, and it connects with the timing, as I said earlier, with how most students really struggle with time, especially early on. If I had to give one tip to improve your timing, it would be practice letting go of the hardest questions. There's usually 6 or 7 questions on the CARS that are really difficult. They're going to stump most people. Most people that are taking the test that day are going to struggle with it. And you can spend 1 minute on it or 2 minutes on it, or you can spend 6 minutes on it, and there's a huge difference in the people who are able to let go of that hard question. They eliminate 1 or 2 answer choices. They mark that question, they give it their best guess, and they say, I'm going to come back to it later. Whereas someone that's a little less experienced, they might say, I really need to get this point right. This is the MCAT, it's the CARS, I need this score. And they'll spend 6 minutes on that question, 5 minutes on that question, and then they're rushing for the rest of the test. And so then they miss out on some easy questions that they wouldn't have otherwise if they had, managed their time well. And I think a really important tip, if I could just give to your listeners, is practice letting go of the hardest questions. If you find yourself spending 1 or 2 minutes on a question, let go of that question. I have a little saying I picked up back when I used to teach for one of the big kind of box MCAT companies, but they would say the question that keeps you out of medical school is not the one you get wrong. It's the question you spend too much time on. You can miss upwards of 8 questions, 9 questions on the CARS and still get a really solid score. But if you spend 6 or 7 minutes on a few CARS questions, that's enough to completely ruin the section. And then the final tip I would just give is I really believe in stair-stepping your passages. It's really hard to start with the mental stamina to do 9 CARS passages in a row. And so I really recommend to my students to do 1 or 2 weeks where they're doing a passage a day, and then they're doing 2 or 3 passages a day, kind of in a block, and then they add another one. And over time, they build up to the stamina of managing their time and focus and concentration over 9 passages. So those would be kind of my 3 tips. Make sure you're starting your practice far enough advance. Be conscious of the hardest questions and give yourself permission to let go. And then using kind of the stair-step approach to scaling up to the 9 passages instead of trying to just go from 0 to 60.
Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, I think any of those tips that you just gave are awesome and definitely, again, the students that I work with that struggle on cars, sometimes it's almost a mental thing, right? It's this, I know that the car section is going to be my worst section. I know this is where I'm going to do the worst in. And then they don't even know, they get paralyzed, right? You get paralyzed because you don't even start studying. You don't even think about how you're going to really be able to do well in this section, because in their head, this is a section I'm going to do poorly on, and I can't just read a book and understand the material and memorize it like I can maybe on some of the other sections. And so I think that people often get into this vicious cycle of thinking that cars is the hardest, not practicing appropriately, not having the right resources, and then kind of rolling downhill. And then speaking about some resources, I mean, Testing Solutions, you guys have what? Something like 13 full-length cars practice tests out there now for people to practice with?
We just released another one, so we're up to 14 full-length practice tests, and then we've actually got a few extra passages out there. So our library is up to 130 cars passages, and we'll actually be publishing a few new tests in the next couple of weeks. So at the risk of hurting my business, the AMC materials are absolutely the best, and those are non-negotiable. Every person that takes the MCAT has to do all of that content and do it incredibly well, thoroughly spend a ton of time on that. But, the reality is most people need more time and more practice to hone their skills in all the sections, but especially in the cars where, as we've said in this conversation, not everybody's familiar with reading critically in these topics. So, that's where you want to make sure that you've got some other resources too, if you need them, to make sure you have enough practice. Because the worst thing you could do is kind of use your very best AMC practice materials when you're making silly mistakes, because then, you've wasted the best material. So I really recommend, finding a company you really trust that thinks that they've been thoughtful and methodical, and use those materials to kind of get started. And then once you've kind of gotten the rust, off and kind of work through some of the silly goofball mistakes, that's when you want to use the best materials, which is the AMC. So, we've worked real hard to get that practice library out there. Very proud of that.
Awesome. And I saw in one of your books, you actually went through a bunch of the other practice material that's out there, AMC, and then all the other sort of material that's out there. And actually, it seems like took the time to go through and rank each one. So if listeners are interested, definitely check out the books on Amazon, because Nick has actually gone through and taken the time to kind of think about what the resources are and how to utilize them, as well as laid out a little bit of a game plan for you guys who are struggling with cars out there.
That is, I think, especially for people even taking the test today versus a few years ago, there's just such a variety of resources out there. And with how easy technology is today, anybody can put up something and sell it. And so it's really hard to know which resources to trust. I generally recommend people should kind of go with resources that have a history. You can go on to Student Doctor Network and read a little bit about them, or on Reddit, and have some people that have gone through the materials, so you can kind of get an objective opinion, or at least some other person's opinion that's not just someone trying to sell you something. But it's hard to know what to trust, and so I think it's important to find some resources that you have confidence in.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about med school and how it's going. And the reason I asked that question, to shift away from cars for a second, is because, the people who are listening to this podcast are really ambitious pre-meds out there. And what they they obviously have this goal of getting into med school. There's multiple hurdles along the way. MCAT and the car section certainly being one of them. But the ultimate goal is obviously to get into med school, be a practicing physician. And I think it's often helpful for them to hear just a little bit about what med school is like. How is it different than what you thought it was going to be, particularly coming from this non-traditional path that you came from?
Maybe if I can tweak the question a little bit, I'll start with what I thought it would be, which is it's hard. I thought it was going to be hard, and it's harder than I thought, but it's also so much cooler than I thought too. Like I knew it was going to be cool, but it is just really, really, just being able to meet with patients, apply what you're learning, see how this kind of book knowledge that sometimes feels a little bit abstract, see it affecting a real person's life and bringing in treatment and cutting edge research, is just very cool. So, I think in those regards, it's in line with what I hoped it would be. Maybe I hoped it would be a little easier. I think the biggest difference is I thought that I would do nothing else in my med school time except med school. And the reality is especially if you go to a school, this is something that I would really encourage your listeners. If you're fortunate enough to be in a situation where you can kind of have a little bit of discretion, if you're sitting on one or two a couple acceptances, I should say, is to really, and even when you're thinking about the schools to apply to, make sure that it's the kind of place you want to spend a lot of time at, that it's in the same kind of character and personality, because you can go off the rankings and just kind of, that's the order you're going to go in. But I really found a place in Stanford that really aligned with kind of my values and my pace of life, what the variety of interests I have, that was really welcome there. And so I think that has helped allow me to not just do med school, but kind of have some of these other opportunities that are important to me. They might not be important to everybody. There might be something else that's important to someone else. But I think that was something that I kind of stumbled into and didn't expect. And so maybe that was a difference, because I kind of thought all med schools were the same. And the reality is while, they have that saying, there are no bad med schools, I think that's pretty much true. I do think that they have different characters, different personalities. And so that was something that I really didn't expect and just got really fortunate to stumble into. But in talking with friends that are at other medical schools, just how different of an experience they've had versus I've had, I think we surprise each other kind of sharing stories. So that would be the biggest difference, is just kind of how, each place can be kind of unique in the sort of students they attract, but also kind of the culture at the school.
Yeah, I've worked with thousands of students over the course of the last couple of years. And for those who are fortunate enough to, I guess, have some ability to choose the school, as you mentioned, if you have a couple of acceptances, I think just going and visiting the school, spending some time there is so important, because you're going to spend the next 4 years there, get an understanding of the culture, the people, not just the classroom, because the reality is the classes are probably the most similar thing in medical school, right? I mean, every single medical school across the board learns anatomy, learns physiology, learns biochemistry. But it's sort of what else is available to you, how else that's presented, what other opportunities are out there, maybe what's emphasized in your time on the wards, your time before the wards, like those kind of things that honestly are kind of hard to figure out as a pre-med, are maybe the most important things that a student can look for if they're lucky enough to have some of those opportunities to visit before.
The only thing I would just chip in as well, just tacking onto that, is I think it's also important with, you don't always visit schools before you apply, but I definitely could tell that in terms of the schools I applied to, that I had better results at schools that were similar in my personality, and didn't do as well in terms of, rejections or wait lists at the schools that weren't. And so if you're trying to be kind of optimizing where you're applying, where you're interviewing, also being mindful of that, I think is useful, because it was pretty humorous to see, kind of in hindsight, most of the schools I did well at kind of were similar personality or culture. And then in some of the schools that didn't do well at, also had their own themes. So that might be the only thing I would tack on too for people that are applying.
Awesome. So Nick, you've come all this way. Now you're a CARS expert. You're maybe the CARS expert out there, but one of the biggest CARS experts in the country. You have all this awesome material out there. You're even giving advice on Student Doctor. I can't thank you enough for giving our listeners some advice, and I hope that's helped a few of our listeners sort of understand and put the CARS section in a little bit more perspective, everybody can visit Testing Solutions and mytestingsolutions.com and sign up for some of those CARS passages. And I just imagine that with all the material that's out there, with all the different courses, with all the different videos, having a good, solid practice set of questions is perhaps one of the most important things you can do. And Nick talked about the AMC material being paramount to everything else. And I agree with that as well. But really, there's not a whole ton of AMC material. And as Nick mentioned, you want to save that for really when you're diving deep into your studying, or maybe want to gauge your performance on the MCAT and a practice test. So having material like the My Testing Solutions material is just imperative for all you guys who are going out there and studying for the MCAT. So, Nick, any last words for our listeners out there who are tackling the CARS section?
I would just say, as you mentioned earlier with students you've worked with, I think there's a lot of mental head games that go into this section. And the reality is I haven't met or worked with a student yet that I didn't think could get a good score. You just got to give yourself the right ingredients, some good passages, give yourself plenty of time. And unfortunately, there aren't any shortcuts. You just got to put in the work. You got to put in the time. But if you're willing to do that, I think you can do well. And I think that's the encouraging message. Just find a resource, find a strategy that you trust, and get to work, get to moving, because it might feel like a long journey, but before you know it, you take the MCAT and then you're on to applications. It goes pretty quick. So I would say you can definitely do it. Don't be discouraged, and don't start out with a mentality of this is a section that's just not going to work out for me, because I believe it can. I can believe it can work out for just about anybody.
Awesome. So Nick Zehner, thank you so much for joining us. As we mentioned, Nick is a Stanford medical student, the founder of My Testing Solutions, a CARS expert, a master's in divinity, a Peace Corps member, and all kinds of other things. Just an incredible guy. I would encourage all of you guys to check out mytestingsolutions.com to learn a little bit more about Nick. And as always, we're available for you at Prospective Doctor and medschoolcoach.com. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey.